pleasure that I present the speaker this evening, who is a friend and a woman I admire very greatly because she did something that we probably all should do. She saw a need and she set to work and made an organization which has done wonders to meet this need. She has an illustrious academic background and is also a Jersey cow farmer in small dimensions in Windham, Vermont. And it's with great pleasure that I let her explain the rest of her very interesting and fascinating and necessary operation with Java. Susanna Grannis.
Thank you, Cynthia. Lovely. And thanks to the Windham World Affairs Council and to SIP for this opportunity to talk with you, and thank you all for coming. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is in a book that I recently published called Hope Amidst Despair. You can see it up there. But it comes from many, many years of working in Africa with children affected by HIV/AIDS. The book comes out of that, and my talk will as well. You all know that Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is the epicenter of the AIDS pandemic, a pandemic which continues. My own focus has been on the children affected for many reasons. My own work has been with children. But the children affected by HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa are generally neglected and without a voice, and very often invisible. I'll read to you an observation, and I will read others here and there throughout the time that I'm talking. They come from my own observations and talk with children over the years. Jeanette, walking along the road at the end of the day, looks like the other children on their way home from school, but her situation is very different from what an outsider might imagine. She didn't go to school that day, in fact, because she lacks the money for the school contribution and for paper and pencils. She only went to school for a few days at the beginning of the year and was sent away because of non-payment. And she's walking home from a visit to a friend of her now deceased parents, searching for food for herself and her younger brother. And there are many, many instances of children spending their days looking for food. This is a situation that needs, in my view, a lot of attention. It has to do with the future of human capital in communities and countries. It has to do with avoiding future conflicts. If children are uneducated and uncared for, they are more likely to become involved in conflict. And ultimately, as the Quran and the Bible and all our sources tell us, we need to care for orphans and children in need. Unfortunately, children are not getting help at the level one would hope. 2 years ago, the level of support was in 19 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The median level of external support, I don't mean neighbors helping out with food, I mean money coming in, was about 12%. And as is true in all of what we have to tell you, is that there is a huge range. The low in sub-Saharan Africa is in Sierra Leone at 1% of external money. And this was a couple of years ago. Hopefully it is better, but it continues to be a real issue. Several years ago, 16 years ago to be exact, my husband Joe Grannis and I were Fulbright professors at the University of Namibia. And we learned a lot at that time. We learned about the disease, although no one was talking about it, it was sort of, you heard about it. A disease most people called SLIM at that time. We came back and I was very concerned, and with family and friends started in 2003-04 an organization called CHABA, Children Affected by HIV/AIDS. And in the course of the time between then and 2010, when I stepped away as the executive director, I made many trips to Africa and worked with grassroots projects that are led by young adults. Now in Rwanda and Burundi, but originally we were working in projects in South Africa and Namibia as well. There's material at the back of the room about Chamba, and I will be making references to it. The book is not totally about Chamba alone, but it is obviously the key of my own concerns here. In 1996, when we were in Namibia, as I said, it was a very, a time when very little was said. But meanwhile, the pandemic was spreading across, especially southern Africa, like wildfire. Just to give you an idea of its spread, listen to this. Using prenatal clinic data, which is data that is supported across the years. This is from South Africa. In 1993, a little more than 4% of the women who came were infected. By 2001, that had grown to almost 25%. And in 2005, it was 30%. Since then, it has probably leveled off, but I don't have the current data on that. The spread has been phenomenal. And at the same time that that was happening, there was silence. Silence, tremendous stigma, and secrecy. A lot of that has improved, but it still exists. And children are stigmatized. Children who are orphans to AIDS or affected by AIDS are stigmatized, and it affects them very strongly. A 13-year-old girl in Rwanda, a very shy and quiet girl, told us of her experience was living with an uncle. Mediatrice said, "My uncle sometimes is like embarrassing me, shaming me. You must have AIDS. Your mother died of it. When he talks like that, I don't know what to do. I feel it in my heart." Eshe, a bright 13-year-old who is infected, said, "I don't tell people I'm infected because they would stigmatize me. The leaders here know. They try to look after me." This affects their self-esteem and their whole presence to the world. Stigma creates the silence. The silence prevents people from being tested and going forward. And the whole thing is cloaked still, even today, in secrecy. It is much better, but there is tremendous secrecy. A book by a South African named Johnny Steinberg tells of a story of how people looked at one another suspiciously and who was infected and who was not. A clinic on wheels was brought to an obscure village and parked where people could go in and be tested. It was right next to a hill, and lots of young people sat on the hill, and they watched their neighbors go in the clinic. And if they came out pretty soon, they knew they were not infected. But if they came out much later, they had been counseled, they knew they were infected. So all the secret and the stigma went through. And totally inadvertent, really serious error was made to increase this problem. In the course of the first decade of this century and since, a tremendous amount of effort and work has gone into alleviating this situation. This happens to be one of Chamba's projects. The children are at a gathering, and Joe and I were visiting. From almost in 2000, almost no poor people had any access to antiretrovirals to fight their immune system, improve their immune system. People were dying, young people were dying and leaving orphans, and there were more and more orphans. Since then, with a great deal of effort, bravery, intelligence, money, the antiretroviral treatment has grown. Fewer people are dying, but it is not over. The situation is still quite dire. More than 15 million children are orphaned to AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. That means they've lost either one or both parents. And there are 22.5 million people still infected. The impact is far more than the health situation, as you can imagine. It impacts farmers, teachers, health workers, business people, and in areas of high levels of infection, the economy has gone down. And as you might expect, that has increased the level of poverty, which is very, very much felt by the children left behind. The poverty comes in clusters. Joe and I had a grandson who was born in, just to give you one idea of the impact of poverty on life expectancy. We had a grandson who was born in 2008. According to the statistics, we can expect that he might live to 2087. Another baby born the same year in most of sub-Saharan Africa can only expect to live to 2061. 26 years difference. HIV/AIDS is part of it. It's particularly part of it as it relates to poverty. And what happens with children is through their malnourishment and so forth is that their great numbers are underweight, great numbers are stunted. We have one project in Burundi, for example. Burundi is a very poor country, as you undoubtedly know. There, over half the children under 5 are stunted. That means, of course, that physically and cognitively, they cannot hope for a strong, effective life. It is impacted as well on gender. Perhaps you have heard things are quite difficult by gender in regard to HIV/AIDS. Nearly 60% of the people who are infected in sub-Saharan Africa are women and girls. I mean, you would expect, since it's in the heterosexual group, that it would be 50-50, and it's not. It's 60% are women. And young women are particularly at risk. In South Africa, males between the age of 15 and 24, 4.5% are infected. Among the girls of the same age, almost 14% are infected. And in other countries, it's at least twice at that age level. Why are these gender differences there? It's easy to blame the men, but it's very, very complicated, and it has to do with a number of factors. For young girls, their physiology is a matter. If they haven't fully physically matured, they're more likely to be infected. There's a great deal of controversy about condom use in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's lessening now, thank goodness. People were urged to use abstinence only, or the famous ABC approach, which was condom as a last resort. So that's a problem. I was at a meeting with our young leaders once, and the young men and the young women were separated. They decided they would do it that way, and discuss this issue that twice as many young women are infected as young men, and they were to discuss it. The young men came back and said, the women don't want us to use condoms. I had always heard that it was the men that didn't want to use condoms. Well, it's both, because the highest and the most important thing for a young African woman is to have a baby. And so any block to that goal is a problem. So condom use is a problem. Wives pretty much have to acquiesce. Joe and I were at a workshop in Rwanda with teachers and students, high school students, a number of years ago, and we were presenting situations about whether a person could become infected or not. So there were men and women and young men and women. And one situation that we told them was a man goes away on a work assignment for 2 months. He's gone out of the country for 2 months. He comes back and he wants to have sex with his wife, or he does have unprotected sex with his wife. Could she become infected? Well, the women there and the girls said, of course. And the men said, oh no. I mean, the gulf between what people wish and what people will talk about and what they won't talk about is huge, and it's very, very important. Alcohol use increases the risk, of course. Violence as well. And there is a lot of reporting of sexual violence against young women, particularly in many countries. Particularly, it's been particularly looked at in South Africa and countries near it, such as Lesotho. Large proportions of men and women, 47 and 40% in Lesotho, agree that women have no right to refuse sex with their partners. And 58% of women agree it's permissible for women to be hit by their husbands. So, it begins with little children learning. Girls learn to be acquiescent, boys learn to be aggressive. Teachers and parents see it as a childhood thing, but it builds up. And what needs to happen is education for boys and girls, and not just girls, which some people are doing. Gender is an issue, and it's beginning to be talked about, but it hadn't been for some years. In our projects, when the young leaders talk to the youngsters about HIV prevention, they talk about how sex is to be negotiated. A, whether there will be sex, B, whether a condom will be used, and that girls have as much right as boys in making those decisions. Whether that will bear itself out through universally, but I've talked to the children and they really are very strong about that, boys and girls. It's a positive thing, I think. Another gender issue has to do with grandmothers. As parents die, the grandparents, but usually the grandmother, takes in more and more children. I heard of a woman in Uganda who was caring for 32 of her grandchildren. This happens to be a grandmother and child in our project, and they are doing wonderfully. There's an aunt that lives with them as well. This child is very well taken care of, and is the focus of her grandmother's eye. She proudly showed me her garden and everything and the food that the girl gets, and that's good. It isn't always the case. And the big worry for these grandparents is what will happen to the children after they die. And they talk about that. Some children end up living without any adult at all. And this again is one of Chava's stories. The young woman on the right, she and her twin sister were left with, their mother died, and they were left with 2 little brothers, and they went to a church, and their house was falling apart. And they went to a church, and they said in the church, if there are any people here who need a house, come and speak to us. And, well, they went, along with probably lots of other people, and the church elders came and visited with them, and 2 days later they had this little concrete block house with 3 rooms and their own latrine, which is a big deal. And so they invited their 4 little boy cousins to come live with them, which is the African way. Like the grandmothers take in all the children, people take in, many, many families take in children. children like this are very resilient. And that's something that we have found needs to be promoted and built upon. This is one story of a resilient child. The woman sitting on the stool, this was a girl named Jean who drew this picture and talked to me when she was in the 6th grade a couple years ago. Her mother is sitting there crying. She's just come from the hospital and she's just learned that she's infected. And she's very frightened, John told me, really scared. So she, and I forget, I think there were 9 children in that family. She and some of her siblings, do you see the little stick figures at the bottom? Went to Amahoro, which is one of the Chava projects, and spoke to the leader. And that great big young man on the lower left is the leader. And told him how frightened they were and how their mother was crying. And he said, you don't have to worry about that. It's not going to be that way. She's not going to die. And explained all about where she needs to go and how she needs to get enrolled so that she could get antiretrovirals. And indeed, Rwanda is doing a very, very positive job in bringing antiretrovirals to its people in need. So that's the story. The woman on the left, by the way, is a neighbor that they went to who would not help them. And why Jean put that in the, it was so prominent. But the rest of the picture is a story of her taking the lead, finding out. And she told me that what she took away with that, she went home, she told her mother that she wasn't going to die, that she was going to live, and that she and the other children in the household would take care and do work and take care of her. And that's the kind of strength and resiliency we want to see and do see. There's another child, this is Marianne Thee, who is infected. She drew a picture. She actually drew several pictures in chronology. These children haven't done drawings, and so the idea of doing a drawing was puzzling, but they certainly expressed themselves well. Anyway, I'll tell you what. That is, she is the person on that bed. And those little markings, she says they're the bad part, the HIV that are leaving her. She'd been put on medicine. She doesn't quite understand what's happening. But she is on antiretrovirals, and they're leaving her, and she's getting well. And that's a friend of hers looking dismayed about the prospect. This is a very, very good student, a bright child, who says, as you can see, I am no longer sick every day. And she's going forward with her life. The story of antiretrovirals is amazing. Once, several years ago, with 2 colleagues, we were at a project that we were then supporting in northeastern South Africa, in a little corner just below Mozambique, and just east of Swaziland, a very remote, highly impacted area with HIV. And there was a little hospital there, and there were doctors, and it was some kind of a social thing. And the doctors, they hadn't been able to get antiretrovirals. As some of you may know, South Africa was very, very slow in getting drugs to help their infected people because of the politics during Mbeke's presidency. But anyway, and these people were a different political party in that area, so they were even less likely to get it. They were finally getting antiretrovirals. Now these doctors had seen patient after patient after patient die, leaving orphans and leaving families in jeopardy. They were finally beginning to get some antiretrovirals, and they talked about it was like Lazarus rising from the dead. And instead of bewailing all the people they'd lost, they were talking about the wonders of these people who are lying on their sick beds and after a month of taking medicine are up out in their gardens producing food for their families. So the antiretroviral story is a complex one, but it's a wonderful one. Nearly 50% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa who need antiretrovirals are now getting them. That doesn't, we wish it were better, but that's a huge increase since 2000 when it began. That's with the old criteria, and now it's higher, but it's still, more and more people are getting them, have been getting them, and it varies from country to country. In Burundi, only 27% of those who need them get them. In Rwanda, it's 95%. Two countries right close together, very similar in culturally, language-wise, in history, in every way, and there are those differences. Before I go into why, let me just say children are less likely everywhere to get antiretrovirals than adults. Well, why would there be these differences? Well, you probably all know the answer. It's no secret. It has to do with money. It has to do with foreign aid. It has to do with the money that these countries are able to get through PEPFAR, our own, which has been a very generous way in which people have been able to access antiretrovirals, and the Global Fund. And the money that has gone for antiretrovirals has increased every single year until now. In November of 2011, the Global Fund announced that it would not have a grant application for 2013, and that they would keep some people at the current level, meaning no new people who come up and need them will get them. That was pretty serious and pretty scary. And I've been trying to figure out what we're doing with PEPFAR, and it's pretty hard to figure out. The Obama budget was just sent to Congress last week, I think. The U.S. government folks are talking about how a great deal is going forward, but the critics are saying, hey, wait a minute, it's a switch and bait game. They're taking away from PEPFAR and putting it in the Global Fund, but the net result is less money. And other countries, especially countries in economic turmoil, are not coming up to the mark in terms of putting money in antiretrovirals. And already I've been reading of countries that have shortages. I've read of shortages in Malawi and in Zambia. Uganda's grant was just cut. Burundi has pretty much lost what it had, which wasn't much, etc. I'm afraid for the future. Yes?
I just have a quick question about that, because my understanding is that when the funding comes from the U.S. and other, or some other developed countries, that those come through non-generic drugs. That we purchase from pharmaceutical companies, but that there's a big market of pharmaceutical companies that do generic, particularly in South Africa and India and in Bangladesh. Has that made a difference? Because
yes.
Our money would go further if
right,
we weren't
right.
buying from.
Right, thank you. The cost has gone way down.
Yeah.
Yes. And it isn't just right now it's gone down. It's been going down as agreements have been made. And some of the U.S. money is going for the generic. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that Doctors Without Borders and other well-respected organizations like that are very, very concerned. So that's a good point, and I don't know the detail there. So we'll see. We'll watch that. Something that's very, very important and really quite positive is what's happened in terms of the attempts to prevent mother-to-child transmission. And here's a group of well-baby mothers and children. If mothers who are infected do not get antiretrovirals during their pregnancy, they're somewhat likely to infect their babies, both during the birth process or with breastfeeding. Antiretrovirals brings down from estimates around 1/3 to as low in this country as 1%. So it isn't quite that same way in Africa because they're not using as sophisticated medications. But it is making a difference. And there are some countries where nearly every infected pregnant mom gets antiretrovirals. And by the way, let me just say that on March 10th, the Brattleboro Women's Film Festival is showing an incredibly gorgeous film. Gorgeous is the wrong word. Deeply moving film called The Carrier, which features a woman faced with this issue. I recommend it. It's really quite a fine film. So this is an area of considerable promise. And I have met children who, even before, if children are not treated at birth, if they're infected at birth and the family is very poor, they're very likely to die within a year or two. With good care, and they may live much longer. It's a terrible thing, as you can imagine, to be a mom and be infected and know or fear that you will give your child a chronic disease. So this is really a great move forward, and hopefully it will mean fewer infected children. So the future depends on money, obviously, and I've talked about, we've mentioned the whole, the great increase, and now it seems to be going back, and we have to watch it to see what will happen. The problem ultimately is not sustainable, because even before these downturns in money, twice as many people become infected every day as are put on antivirals. This is before any downturn in money. So the issue and the problem that needs to be addressed is in prevention, obviously. Prevention can be through technical means. A vaccine, which we don't have yet, but may someday. And people continue to work on it, which is, I think, wonderful. There's been a lot of work in developing gels for women to use, and there was one study that was extremely positive and hopeful, and then a study that was to corroborate the findings didn't find the findings, and more is going on. But there's still hope that a gel will be developed that women can use and use privately and with security, that it will reduce their infection rate. Condoms, of course. Circumcision, male circumcision is a somewhat, last few years, people have talked about it. It reduces transmission from female to male by a good, more than half. There are issues around circumcision, getting people to come, what people who are circumcised really understand is happening. And of course, recently, in this last few months, it's more and more evident that antiretrovirals themselves are an effective prevention technique. People who are taking antiretrovirals as a preventive are very unlikely to be infected. People who are newly infected, if they're quickly on antiretrovirals, are far less likely to infect sexual partners. But since we haven't been able to get half the people who need them to go on living the antiretrovirals, we're looking at this down quite a long way. I got to go to the UN on World AIDS Day this past year, and it was a little bit like sitting in a different universe, because they announced on World AIDS Day that we're looking at no more deaths to AIDS, no more infected babies due to AIDS, and no more stigma, and no new infections. And I'm thinking, where is this going to happen? This is wonderful. And the U.S. has kind of picked this up too in the government announcements. And yes, all those things can happen. This is a preventable disease. It can happen. And it is happening, but it's not even happening in this country. Never mind the impoverished sub-Saharan Africa. So what we need to do is to continue to pursue behavioral attempts to prevent through behavior. One of the things that young people need to know is how they get antiretrovirals. I mean, how they get HIV. And you would be amazed that even though many schools in Africa, and certainly in this country, are teaching about it, people don't really understand it. I was talking to a group of high school students in Brooklyn, New York, a couple months ago, and one of the girls said, "How do you get AIDS?" And she'd been in health classes all along. She wasn't listening, it wasn't taught well, who knows? But and today, in recent data, a year or so ago, about half of the teenagers questioned about their knowledge level of HIV is inadequate. Half is inadequate, half is not. We use the same questions with our own kids who have HIV prevention programs, and they were much, much higher, I'm glad to say. And this is a case in point. These two young people are teaching HIV prevention. They are the vice president and president of our largest organization. It's called Amahoro. They are both in post-secondary education. He won a full scholarship to the university. She's in a special program that I'm not quite sure what she's learning. Anyway, they're both terrific and wonderful, and I've known them. I met them both in like 2004 or 5. They're doing a wonderful job, and here they are teaching younger children in a room about HIV prevention, and they're talking, and all the children in the room know one another. There are about 25 of them, and they're talking straight. You see what he has in his hand. He has a dildo in his hand. He had that in his hand, he put it on the desk. They had condoms. The children took turns putting them on and learning how to put them on. I mean, at my age, to think that that would be in the classroom is beyond anything. But this is life and death. So it's absolutely wonderful. And they talk about what else you can do besides have sex to show affection. And then the children started asking questions, and I won't even tell you some of the questions. They were just wonderful, and they were all answered just beautifully. And that's what's needed. It's people the children know and trust, who care about them, in the context with other children they know and trust, and they talk straight. And it's okay to ask the most incredible questions that you can imagine about sex. I mean, these kids, for the most part, don't have parents to talk to them, although not all parents do, of course, and that's particularly true in Africa. But here they have someone they can really ask questions to, and they do. It's such a simple, simple thing, is to have young people talk to young people. It's really simple. Anyway, there is all this bad news, so there's the hope. It comes through more and more, as you can see, from bringing people together and having them learn from one another. This girl and her sister I first met in 2004. Their house, they lived, just the two of them, both parents had died, in a one-room mud and wattle house, 10 by 12 feet, a hump of earth in a sea of other small houses where they had lived alone for the 2 years since their mother had died of AIDS. The house had very few objects. There was no sign of food. There was an empty cooker. Neither girl was in school. Not only did they lack basics, there was something else. They were very shy, passive, withdrawn. The leaders of the association drew them out a bit and learned that their neighbors shunned them for being AIDS infected, which they weren't. As a result, though their house was close to those of many other families, they were essentially alone, day after day, with no school, little or no interaction with their neighbors, and no adults to look in on them. These girls had nothing to do. They were severely diminished. Actually, one of the girls went on a picnic with us a few days after this picture. No, I mean, after I met them. And she just didn't know how to interact with the other children. She was just there. However, here's the transformation. I came back the following year. 300 young people, this is, children had gathered before going into workshop weekend, which focused, not exclusively, but did have HIV prevention. 300 young people were participating in circle games, singing and running, chasing one another. I'm skipping. I saw several children I knew, including 2 sisters. The sisters were transformed from the last time I'd seen them, wonderfully transformed. There they were with their arms around other girls, their friends. After a few minutes of circle games, these girls and their friends formed a small circle and sang a song they had made up about AIDS. It was a plea for a cessation of stigma against children like themselves, orphans and people living with HIV/AIDS. More and more of the hundreds of children gathered around to listen, and as they sang, the girls seemed confident and strong, and when they finished, everyone clapped with generous appreciation. That's the same girl. It was only a year later. There is hope when you empower young people to go and help children. Hope lies in going to school, and there are millions more children in primary school now than there were in 2000. It's one of the Millennium Development Goals, and it's really been searched after. Still, there are many, many children not in school, in primary school. Pre-primary school has only 15%, and those are the children of the more elite. Secondary school is growing, but is still very low. There are issues of quality, class size, materials, the emphasis on rote learning, which is inevitable, because if you have no materials, you can't do much else. Joe and I were in Namibia teaching way back 16 years ago, but classes I've seen much more recently don't look that different. I was in one 5th grade classroom quite often. They had one eraser. And we got some more to them, but they had one eraser. And if somebody needed an eraser, they whistled. They threw the eraser over. They whistled and threw the eraser over. In Rwanda, the class size has been 60. And so they split morning and afternoon, so it's smaller, but the teachers still have as many children. And it's very complicated. And they've also changed their language from their school language from French to English, and they gave the teachers 18 months to learn to teach English. But going to school is a hope. It is a hope. Not being in school is not. Vocational training is beginning to have an inroad in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have a little project called Project Independence, and this is one young man. Let me read to you what one person said. I could not go to secondary school because I had to support my sisters working odd jobs, such as collecting water for the neighbors. Before, I was living day to day. Though now, after hard work and completing my program, I have a stable job as a cook. I have some food now and can even open an account at a local bank. Since my sisters are not in school, I would like to be able to put them in school. My mom is sick with HIV, so I have no long-term plans beyond caring for my family. That was after he finished his program. The young man is now a head chef in a restaurant in Kigali. So, not all the stories are so wonderful, but that is a wonderful story. We have in our little house in Kigali a children's library. 5 of us from Brattleboro carried books and a trip, and other people have taken, but we carried a lot of books. And we set up a library all in English, and these children didn't have no English books. So when they're on school holiday, they come in the hundreds to this little house, which is now being organized in a tutorial and so on. But you should see them come in and pick up the books and pick up words. It's just wonderful. This is increasing human capital. They're going to get more help. They're going to get tutoring. They're going to have some extra extra scholastic activity. Hope lies in getting health care. In Rwanda, children anyone can have a health insurance, very basic, for very little money. In fact, they told me that we should, in this country, pay attention to Rwanda and see if we could do a health program. That is not the case in Burundi, but happily, at least for our project, the 5 leaders of the project, 3 of them are doctors. So they're taking care of the children. Hope lies in helping the family, build the families up. Hope, and by family we mean a remaining parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, sometimes even a neighbor. And so our projects and many other projects provide some basic means for families to provide food for their children. That grandmother I had a picture of before is doing such a great job. She got goats from the very beginning, and she told me that the first goat had 5, births after that, and she'd gotten some money from all of that. Very pleased with it. What we have found is important is visiting families and children in their homes. And on the left is one of our leaders in a visit, on a home visit. And on the right is a wonderful project in South Africa called Isibindi, where the young, again, the people who care for the children are young adults. And they are assigned families, and they essentially move in and do whatever is needed in the family. They might have 7 families they're caring for. They might have 5, but they are working full-time. In some families, they go and teach the children how to cook, how to shop. They intervene in the school. They teach the children resilience, how to take care of themselves. And they stay with them until they're on their feet. They do that for about $180 in 2006 money, $180 per child per year. Our projects, which some children get some things and some get others, but it's far less. It's about $90 a year to get children in schools, health, and so forth. And the home visits are absolutely incredible. It's not that people have to come up with food or tea or give you anything. The leaders go in, they know the families, they find out what's going on, they keep track of the families, and did you do this and did you do that? And even though it's a handful of young adults, the 3,000 children in the projects are all reached in this way. Not as often as we would like. As I said, we have workshops, 2-day workshops, HIV prevention, hygiene for the youngest kids, children's rights, agriculture projects, various applied things you need on the ground. But over the years, what I've come away with is for children to feel they have a place where they belong. After they've lost parents, or they're moved into some other home, maybe some other town, their life is disrupted in serious, deep ways. For them to belong to an association where they belong, and they feel and they know they belong, is very, very important. All of our projects meet once a week. The children come once a week. And they have skits and songs and dances and fun. The young leaders who themselves were orphaned in genocide in Rwanda or otherwise know that children need to have fun. It's not all about the basics. The basics are critical. But being together is just an absolute critical matter. Over and over again, the children say, it takes away the loneliness. I actually wanted to entitle this book, Taking Away the Loneliness, but the publisher didn't think people would know what I meant. So I didn't. But this is my way of asserting, because that's what it is. And you see them with their arms around each other all the time. And here's what people have said, not to us, but to a researcher from Great Britain. We have friends. We have people helping us, and we have something like a family here. And we come here and have fun, and we forget about our problems, another one said. But something that really interested me to come to Amahoro is the feeling I have after the gatherings or coming to leaders, because at least I have someone to talk to, having someone else who has the same problem. I feel great having someone to discuss with. And I've also done the training. She means vocation training. I've done catering services, but I haven't gotten the internship yet, but I'm hoping to get one. In the future, I'm sure that I will have a job and help my brothers and sisters. And over again, it takes away the loneliness, it's my family, and it will enable me to take care of my family. These are children who are really resilient. I don't know if you know of the story of the starfish. Okay, here it is. A man comes over a dune before the ocean, and stretched out on either side as far as he can see are starfish flopping in the sun. And the tide is going out, and the starfish aren't going to be able to get into the water. He sees a young woman down by the edge, and she's leaning over, she's throwing starfish in, and so forth, one after another. And he says, "Young lady, you're never going to get all those starfish." And she said, "I know, but I've gotten this one, and I've gotten this one." So yes, the big issue is scaling up, taking care of all those children. Meanwhile, we're taking care of this one, and we're learning quite a bit. And I had hoped that other people would start small grassroots projects like we have. Anyway, so that's my story, and I would be happy to answer any questions. What questions do you have? Any questions? Yes.
AIDS is a very horrible disease, and so there's a popular response to deal with that. And my question would be, what is the impact of the money that goes into AIDS? What impact does that have on other aspects of the health sector, like maternal child care?
The money?
The money, you know, it can lead to things like inflation in other in healthcare workers as opposed to other workers and things like that. And it can have a very disruptive effect on me.
I don't know if this is what there has been a lot of criticism or questioning about all the money going to AIDS, and what about malaria, and what about maternal health, and a whole raft of problems that in developing countries, particularly poor ones, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, experience. I heard someone recently say, well, there's the AIDS, plenty of money for AIDS, but not for this. That's not, of course, the case. And to say we need to choose one and not the other is to say, in my view, that we're not doing the job all around. There has been a movement to consolidate clinics. So you don't have an AIDS clinic and a this clinic and a that clinic, but to bring the health services together. Do you know Partners in Health?
Sure.
Partners in Health has projects in Haiti and in some African countries, including Rwanda. And it is primarily AIDS, but you wouldn't know that when you go there, because what you see is teaching agronomy, you see nutrition classes, you see the whole community service effort. So it shouldn't, and I think it's increasingly not just focused on HIV/AIDS. But if there's not enough money and people are dying, I mean, it's a pretty difficult situation.
You mentioned behavioral change. The problem of promiscuity and multiple sexual partners and so on. Do you feel as if any progress is being made in that sphere in your experience?
I'm reading that in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and with certain age groups, there has been a diminishing of multiple networks of sexual partners, which is a major way of, and I should have said this, a major way of the spread of the disease. Because let's say, there are people, sexual partners, and each one has 2 or 3 other partners, and you begin to get a whole network of people who don't know each other, of course. And the minute as quickly after the first one becomes infected, the whole network becomes infected. And there's been a great deal of talk about that. And one of the young women said, and you perhaps have heard other people say it, for the men, it isn't just the men, but for the men, she said, they're like a bull in a field of cows. They think they have access to all of the cows. So that kind of thing is being talked about. And there are changes. And there is a decrease in new infections. It hasn't disappeared. I met a 15-year-old with 2 or 3 little brothers some years back in a nice house, but there was nothing in the house. And the story was that she had, and her brothers had gone to live with a man, a friend, whose wife was not happy and sent him back. And sometimes he came by with food. Well, he came by with more than food. And what choice did she have, alone, with little brothers she wanted to keep alive? So it's terribly complicated, yeah.
The federal government, our federal government, is at the end of this year is cutting all funding for prevention programs for AIDS. And my understanding
Here and abroad?
Here in this country, and my understanding is that's a reflection of the new focus on treating AIDS that exists and just letting go of the prevention piece of it.
I didn't know they were going to do that. That's terrible. It's not going to work.
Well,
You know,
if you talk to the people at the AIDS Project in Brattleboro, they'll tell you they have no way, no influence, no way to change what's happening.
And yet, you know, our own experience is that it's not
it's
difficult.
their experience too with the AIDS Project that prevention works. It's
Right.
absolutely necessary
Right.
to keep from having new infected populations.
Right.
But the money's going to be gone at the end of this year.
And I don't know what the PEPFAR, how they will allocate it, if they will change the allocation that there has been, because right along there's been a certain amount for antiretroviral treatment and for prevention and care, those 3. But now that they talk about treatment and prevention being the same thing, I worry about behavioral change. That's the part that's going to get lost.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all. What do you think that our country might learn from different countries in Africa, especially those that you have experience with, in remedying these the issues around HIV and AIDS and reducing these issues and addressing them? What can we learn in this country from the African countries that you have worked with?
Right. Well, there are many things we can learn. I think a critical factor is being able to talk and have safe places to talk and starting that talk at a very early age. I mean, we don't wait till high school to talk to children about HIV prevention. We have to start much, much earlier. And they learn that in Africa, and in some places are doing that. That's one thing. In general, I wish children, people, all of us in this country, could learn about life beyond our shores. It's becoming increasingly limited, narrowed, unaware. People are unaware of what's going on, and they have blinders on about the world, and that's really unfortunate. I think that efforts that we make to help children become strong and resilient and able to function on their own and make good choices on their own with one another is a very powerful thing. It strengthens the children one-to-one, and it doesn't rely on money and adults, if we can do that.
Could you tell me, you know the life expectancy of a child born infected with, well, who has HIV, say in Rwanda?
I don't know a specific date, but I do know that the under 5 mortality rate has been going down. It's been going down across Africa. It hasn't, and that includes children who are infected by AIDS. And I have read that in very poor families, in very poor regions, children born infected, whose mother is infected and may be very sick, have a very, very limited chance of living. But that girl who I had the picture with, she was infected at birth and she was 13. And she didn't start getting antiretrovirals until she was 11. So she lived that long because she was living with good health and care before she got antiretrovirals. I haven't totally answered your question, but...
No, I was curious because I was speaking with a physician in Rwanda who worked with HIV children, and he said that the biggest problem with their weekly programs was that once the children become adolescents, they have enough knowledge to know that there's little hope for them. And his goal was to try and boost their resilience. And I thought, but this I may be incorrect with, I thought he said that these kids know that they've got until about 30 years old to live. And that's why I was wondering if you could give me some clarification.
That the life expectancy of a child on antiretrovirals is until age 30?
I may have misunderstood, but I thought that's what he said.
Yeah, I haven't read that. I don't know if that's the case. I would be surprised if anyone knows yet what it would be. Nobody has lived that long with antiretrovirals. And in this country, I know there are people who've been on antiretrovirals for 30 years and are still living. So I would be surprised.
I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, I hope so.
I'm really struck by your commenting that maybe 3 times as many women are infected with HIV/AIDS than men.
Among young women.
Of young women. I don't really understand that. You described it some, but it's hard to understand.
Many young women who are infected have sex with older men who have been having sex many more years and have been infected that way.
Oh, okay.
Does that?
Yeah, I didn't realize that. That makes sense.
Okay.
Plus men may have multiple partners.
That's right. Right, and have become infected that way and infect a young woman. And may be able, because of having more money, to entice her. Which is one reason why girls who stay in school longer are less apt to become infected, because they won't have access to older men, and if they do have sex, it's with people their age who are less likely to be infected. Yes?
Really this great proliferation of HIV in the 90s. And I was surprised that it was the 90s rather than the 80s, as it was in this country.
That's a very good question. According to a historian, an African historian who did a book on the history of HIV/AIDS in Africa, and there's a new book about to come out. But anyway, the epidemic started much, much earlier as it crossed from animals, chimps to people. And the epidemic as such started in Kinshasa, and way back in the 70s. And then it moved east into eastern Africa, to Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi, and then south into southern Africa. And it was the southern African countries that I was referring to in the 90s, and that was after. Well, it happens that I have a few copies of my book, which I'd be happy to sell you. It's for $20, and $10 of that covers my expenses, and $10 is for Chavo. And I'd be happy to sell it and sign it, if you would like. If there are students here, it's $10. Do you want to see a 5-minute piece of a skit from a workshop? Okay. This girl walking in is pretending to be a teacher, and the children on the bench there are her students. She goes and she says she has to leave the children, and she leaves the room, and she goes out, and they start playing, and the little boy who is right here, who has the most wonderfully expressive face, begins to play a little game with the children. They all get up and they're dancing and singing, and she comes in and she says, "Stop that, stop that." And then he teases her and he gets her to do the dancing. So she's doing the dancing, and in comes another girl who's playing the principal of the school. And she gets really mad at the teacher and the kids, and the same little boy does his little thing like this. And then the principal starts doing it. And then in comes, I guess it's the district administrator or something, and he's pretty mad. Same thing happens. And then in comes a guy, one of the leaders, who had on a suit and a pillow in his stomach. He's going like this, and he's really mad. And finally, they're all dancing, and there are just hundreds of children here, laughing and laughing and laughing. That's one of the things that happens at the gathering. So, thank you very much.